Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I have got whizzing around in front of me today is a Death Guard Legionary of, well, the 40k version of the Death Guard. Now these fellas I have actually done on the channel before, but that was a good 7 years ago now. So the video itself is a little dated and production methods have improved, along with some of the paints that are available to make this a little bit easier. Now, there's quite a few paints listed in the description you'll see today, and the reason being is because there's quite a few little bits on this one guy which you might see replicated across an entire army. So you're probably not going to need all of these paints to paint every single Death Guard Marine in your 40k army, but because this fella has so many little extra bits and pieces, I think he makes a handy example for what you can do to make those little bits stand out. So all of those paints will be listed in the description, same as always. Let's get started. So of course, first thing to do with your miniature is to prime him, and here I've used Raven Black from Colorforge. Now there's a couple of reasons for this. First is that it not being a pure black is kind of helpful for the next step, but I'm bringing up Colorforge specifically because what I'm going to do is to brown this out a little bit. You'll see what I mean in a second here. If you have got access to Colorforge primers, what I'd suggest would be, instead of using the black, pick up Hyrax Brown and use that as the primer for the next couple of stages. You'll see what I mean. This is going to be nice and simple. If you can't get that, then black will do. Any black. I've used Raven Black because it's the one that I've got, and it's a nice segue into, Colorforge primers. So if you are using a black primer, the first step I'm going to do here is I've taken some oak brown from the army painter and thinned this down roughly half and half with water, maybe a little bit more water. It doesn't matter too much. We want it to basically be a shade, like a wash, just over the top of everything. This is going to look a little bit different than it would if we'd used Hyrax Brown to prime. But the important parts, like the recesses, into all of those nooks and crannies, are going to take on that nice, warm, grimy brown. And yeah, this is going to add a bit of depth to our base coats. Now once that dries, you'll see it is going to end up a little bit lighter than Hyrax Brown Primer would be. This is quite a similar color in the end to Rhinox Hide, so if you want to adjust the recipe as you like, it's not too hard to do. What I'm going to turn to now is a makeup brush. Anything relatively soft here, that's quite gentle. What we're going to do is dip that in a little bit of Castellan Green. And this we're going to quite generously apply over most of the model. So what I'm going to do is, you see, just moving in quick motions, like dry brushing, but I want to leave a bit more behind. I want a little bit of that brown in the recesses, because my recent obsession is with texture on miniatures, and particularly with Death Guard, this will work super well. If you do end up filling in a little bit of the brown bits in the recesses, don't worry, we've got washes and such to do, detail to paint, and we're doing this stage now because, as you can see, the sheer size of the brush, I'm not going to avoid hitting the bolter or the bells or anything like that. So, just a bit of Castellan Green over pretty much the entire miniature. Don't worry about what you're hitting. And let's see what this looks like in a moment. Now, doesn't that look to business? I really like how that turns out over the top of that brown primer or wash that we've used. I think you can see how much quicker it would be if you had that brown primer, but I'm happy with that result as we go in. What I'm going to turn to next is another just makeup brush. You can use the same one if you have dried it thoroughly between each use. And this time a little bit of Death Guard Green, because we want to lighten them up just a bit. This time we're going to apply this a little bit more carefully with more of a stippling motion. We are kind of dry brushing still, but I want to make sure that I'm leaving behind, like I said, a little bit of that texture rather than a pure solid color. So as you jab at more of the exposed stuff, you'll see you build up that color and those little pinpricks of grime kind of show through. So over all of the armor now, and this is a bit easier to concentrate on the parts where you want it to stick. Yeah, let's brighten them up and have them start looking a bit more, well, Death Guard green. Then finally at this stage for the green, what I have, this is Necrotic Flesh from the Army Painter. It's quite similar to Nurgling Green, but it's got a little bit more oomph. It is slightly more saturated. What I have is one of the wedge tip dry brushes from the Army Painter, and I tend to find these really handy for sort of smaller applications of dry brushing like this. A lot of what we're going to be painting is going to end up being covered over by trim and stuff like that, like the edge of his chest piece here. You know, I can dry brush it green, but we're going to bronze that in. But for some of the edges, what you can do is just get in here with a little bit of Necrotic Flesh and give them a slight bit more detail. So hands, edges of boots and what have you, just parts that are going to benefit from a little bit of an edge highlight, but without having to get out the smaller brushes. Now at this stage, we're going to move on and add a couple of smaller details before we get to things like the bronze and the brass and the metal. What I have here is Corax White, and I'm pretty aware some folks really don't like it, find it a little bit difficult to work with. My suggestion is when you first crack it open, pop a couple of drops of Lamian Medium in there, and an agitator or two, little steel ball bearings or something. And you will get, as you can see, pretty good coverage out of a white. Now I'm doing this now because in laying down the base coats for the white on this smoke, you know, from the sensors and what have you, I find it a little bit easier to do this first and then paint the bronze part of the sensor later. It's really up to you, but that's what I think. So that's how I'm going to do it. Then to paint in the lenses on his eyes, what I have is Angelic Red. This is one of the Army Painter's Fanatic line. You could use, I find I've actually forgotten the name of the really bright red from Citadel, but all the same, just pop this in. If you end up with it on the armor itself, like where you don't want it to be, don't worry too much. What I can do in a second here will be to come back with a little bit of Death Guard green and tidy up if I need to. Then again, thinking about the order in which we want to do things here, a lot of the bells and little bits and accessories that are going to be on these guys are normally being held by tentacles. Yay! So I'm going to go ahead, the tentacle stuff I'm applying here Moldy Wine. Now this, again, Army Painter color, it's very similar to Screamer Pink, maybe just a little bit darker and ever so slightly more saturated, which I like for what is coming later on. So, me tentacly bits. Oh, God. I love painting these guys, but they really do make me sick. The tentacles are going to get Moldy Wine. And then any spiky bits, horns, that sort of thing as well. What I have, this is Dusty Skull. Now, this is very similar to Xandri Dust, but where Xandri Dust is a little bit more yellow, you know, it's got kind of a deserty cast to it, this is a bit more neutral. Now this funky little tabard part that he's got, I have here a Wyvern Fury. Now the style with most of the Army Painter stuff tends to be a little bit lighter and a little bit more saturated than most of the equivalent colors you'd see in other ranges. Mostly because they've always kind of planned, you know, you hit this with a wash. This is pretty close to Corn Red. Maybe a little bit closer to Mephiston Red, depending on what angle you're looking at it. It doesn't matter too much. Just a red will work here. Now I think we have all of the little doodads that we need to add different color to. What I'm going to use now, this is Heavy Metal from the John Blanche range over at Army Painter. It's a very, very dark gunmetal color, without being quite as dark as Iron Warriors. So definitely darker than Lead Belcher. But again, we're in the realm of whatever your preference is. I just really like what this does when we're going to wash it later. So chains and what have you. You'll also see that I have painted a bit of the blade here in the bone, because I kind of like the idea that there's that gross biomechanical, you know, bone and metal and, Nurgle's rot getting into everything. So I'm going to take my time and paint this in. And now we get to all of the brassy bits, because man alive, there's a lot of this. What I'm going to use, this is Emperor Gold, and this is another one from the John Blanche range from the Army Painter. Now it is quite close to Balthazar Gold, so again, if you want to stick to Citadel stuff, there's plenty of opportunity there. The reason why I'm using this is kind of twofold. First is that it just covers magnificently. I mean, look at that. That is one quick pass over green, for goodness sake. And we have our brass. And the other reason is the same as why I picked a couple of the other colors. This is just a bit more saturated, a bit warmer. And given what we're going to wash this with, that's quite important. That's not to say you couldn't use Balthazar Gold, or even something like Retributor Armor. And Retributor Armor is one I would recommend over the closest from Army Painter, which is Greedy Gold. It's always the right tool for the job, you know. But this, we're going to cruise around and fill in the brassy bits. And there's quite a few of these. So while I'd love to say this is a quick way of doing things, because he's got so many little jingly janglies, it's going to take a bit of doing. All the same, nice and simple, here we go. Now there's no denying that that does take a bit of doing. There's quite a bit of bronze and brass, so take your time, work your way around. Like I said, it's not challenging, it's just a bit of fuss. What I've got last is some black from Vallejo, and I'm using this because it just covers, it's perfect. You know, you can thin this down an awful lot, and it will still cover perfectly well. I've gone over the ammo belt with a little bit of Prairie Ochre, and you know, I am going to grab here some Greedy Gold, because for the sake of argument, let's look at what it would look like and how different it is compared to that Emperor Gold. So I'm going to paint in the bells with this. You'll see that Greedy Gold is quite a lot brighter. It's neat, but I don't feel like it really fits the Death Guard for the trim and what have you. Really a matter of personal choice, of course. But what I'm going to turn to now is the shade mix that I'm putting together here. This is half and half Grimdark Shadow from the Army Painter. Again, this is a John Blanche line 1. And a little bit of Speedpaint Medium, mixed up half and half. Now, if you don't want to go ahead and pick up this bottle, what you could do would be to mix maybe Military Shade and Dark Tone, or Athonian Camo Shade and Gnome Oil. With the Citadel ones, I would probably not look at adding quite as much medium, but it's up to you. You can experiment with what you like the look of. Now, the reason why I'm using this rather than a brown wash is because this dark black-green, it's really moody. It's got a wonderful depth to it. And yeah, Grimdark really is the word here. It's going to pull together the green and give us a neat, really, like I said, moody, deep green. And over the other colors, like particularly over the brass, it introduces this wonderful, almost grimy recess, but without looking really fetid. It's super hard to explain. That's why I'm applying it over everything, so you can see what it looks like. But over the entire miniature, and then we're going to leave this for about half an hour to dry and see what we end up with. Man, that's cool. When that dries, I love how that turns out. Now, there's actually not a huge amount left to do from this stage, and it does depend a little bit on what miniature you've got. What I have here is some Forest Sprite, which is a speed paint color, and I've mixed this down. This is 1 dot of Forest Sprite to 6 dots of Speedpaint Medium, because I want it to be fairly thin going on. So starting right up against the edge of the white bits, I'm going to add a little of this over all of that smoke sensor, what have you. Now once that funky flame has dried, what I've done is to add just a single drop of Absolution green into the mix that we've already got here. And what I'm going to do now is, starting from about halfway up the flame, start adding this to make the sort of trailing edges a bit darker. And then once that has dried, goodness me, let's get it a shot. I've added just a couple more drops of Absolution green into the mix, and now we're just painting sort of the back third. Now at this point I am really just having fun with it and playing around, but honestly sometimes there's something on a miniature which is fun. Playing around is not a bad thing. So what I've got is a bit of matte white and an old brush I do not mind beating up a bit. And what I'll do is very lightly dry brush so that I'm catching sort of the edges of that smoke. I'm going to leave a little bit of it towards the very tip without any white on it. But this is just going to help that blend. And once that has had time to set, what I've got is 1 dot of Maize Yellow to 12 dots of Speedpaint Medium. I want this to basically be a glaze. Then pop that over all of the fire. It's going to bring in that white and add a little bit of sort of juicy depth to the green as well. Now that's not completely dry yet, but you see where I'm going there. This is definitely a good idea if you've got 3 or 4 guys with sensors or what have you to paint at once. And if you've ever wondered how I would paint warpstone sensors on Skaven, well, there you go. What I have now is Liberator Gold, and I'm going to do a few little bits of this just to highlight some of the brassy parts. Now, in theory, you could also stick here to True Brass from the Army Painter. But I like, because we've used such a dark brassy base coat, I tend to think that giving it a little bit more oomph, a little bit more color, because True Brass is, how to put this? It is more silver with a tiny touch of gold, whereas Liberator Gold is gold with a tiny touch of silver. Really splitting hairs here, but this is what I'm going to use just to dot in some of these little details. Now for the bony bits, what I have is Ancient Stone, and I've messed up my brush a little bit here because I do want quite a fine point. So just rolling that on my palette for a second, and then once I'm satisfied, what I'll do is a few quick short lines which lead to the tip. So there's a little bit of striation in the bone texture there. Now, for the little rubbery tentacle parts, what I have, this is Elderflower. And it's one where, honestly, if you want to save yourself picking up another paint, then just mixing a tiny wee bit of Ancient Stone into the Moldy wine that we used to start these with would probably work just as well. With some plate mail metal, and again, a scraggly old brush you don't mind beating up. What I'm going to do is lightly dry brush along the silver parts, and I'm going to use this to catch the edge of the bolter too. This will work quite well, so you don't have to come in and blast it with another grey or something. Just a little bit of scratchy, silvery stuff on the bolter to give it a bit of shape is plenty of work. Now for a bit of fun here, what I've got is 1 drop of fresh rust to 5 drops of Speedpaint Medium. The rust effect stuff is quite intense going on, so you really want to thin it out. And I've probably got a bit too much on my brush there. But what you can do is smudge it around with your finger too. So what I'm going to do is pick a few little bits where I want it to look like a bit of rust, a bit of grime has started collecting. Particularly this is handy for areas where there's not a lot of definition between different bits of green. So these little pustules and what have you, rather than coming in and painting yet another color, we'll just add some rust on there. And yeah, this, you can do as much of this as you like. Now in typical fashion, I started by warning against the dangers of too much of that, and then I've added loads. And the way that it dries, yeah, you'll probably find that a couple of bits you can pop over once or twice with that stuff. It looks super cool, and it adds some warmth to the color scheme. What I'm going to do now is take him outside, hit him with a matte varnish, and then I'm going to come back and pop a little bit of gloss just over his lenses. Then pop his base on him. The recipe for that will be in the description. Let's get a look at our Nurgle warrior once he is all complete. And so, there at last, our Death Guard is complete. Now, if you have watched the older video, you'll see there's not really that much difference in actual technique. It's really just a case that there are a handful of new paints out there since their last one, and 1 or 2 things I've probably refined a little bit, particularly that bit of smoky flame, the sensor stuff. That's really cool. I love how that's turned out, and I think it adds quite a bit to the miniature. There's still plenty you could do. Highlighting that little head, for example, so gross. Things like the red, or even highlighting the tentacles a little bit further to give them a bit more shape. There's loads you could do. But since there is quite a lot happening already, the risk is making them look a little more busy than might be cool on the tabletop, if that makes sense. All the same, is not a lot of imagination really needed to see how you could take this even further. So this as the base, I'm more than happy. I might finish up a squad of these guys or finish off a kill team, see what happens. So as always, thanks goes out to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you very much for your support, folks. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked down there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.